Hello everyone. In this video, we're starting a brand new chapter. From this point in the course, we are no longer working on the pet foods database. Instead, we're going to work on the database aspect of a simple social media application. Before we talk about how to get started on that, let me first refresh your memory of what the example social media app looks like and what sort of features it has. So for the next 90 seconds, here is a recap of footage from the very beginning of the course intro to refresh your memory of what we're going to work on. So really quick, let me log in as the Brad user. Okay, so you can see my feed is currently empty, and that's because I don't follow any other user accounts yet. But if maybe I search for the word cat, I find this blog post called Being a Cat is Great by a user called Kitty Doe. If I start following that user and then go back to my homepage feed, you can see it's going to show me the posts from that user. Or if I find the dog user, if I search for dog and I click onto their author profile and start following them, now my homepage feed has the latest posts from all of the users I follow. Cool, now I can look at my own profile. I haven't created any posts yet. No one's following me, but I am following 2 users. I can go ahead and create a post if I want to. So my first post, go ahead and save that. Okay, now if I go back to my profile, you can see I have the one post. I can make updates or edits to it. So if I want to add a few exclamations, I can save that change. Perfect. If I want to delete this existing post, I can do that as well. Okay, and then maybe I decide I want to stop following the cat user. I can just go to their profile, click stop following. You get the idea. So now if I go back to my profile, I'm only following the one user. My homepage feed reflects that. So this is a living, breathing web application. Okay, so that recycled review footage is over now. We've jogged our memory of what we're going to be working on. So now the question is, how do we get started? Well, first, let's set the scene or give some context to this project we're jumping into. I don't know what skills and experiences you're personally bringing into this course with you, but just in the hypothetical vacuum context of what you've learned in this course, you are not qualified to be a web developer. But do you know what you absolutely are qualified for? Well, writing MySQL queries. So imagine you're working for a company and their web developer maybe only has experience with a different database system like MongoDB. But management has said that this project needs to use MySQL. And so that web developer, they're able to program the visual design, the visual user interface, the authentication, the security of the server. They can set all of that up, but they need your help writing the MySQL queries, right? In order to make anything truly happen in terms of storing and loading data to and from the database. So, during this chapter, even if you have no desire or intention to become a web developer, you can use your imagination that you're sitting side by side a coworker. They're the web developer, and your job is just to be the team's MySQL person who helps write useful queries. Big picture, I think it's super useful to see how MySQL is used in the real world like this to power all sorts of different applications. Also, I think it's super encouraging to see how portable and universal your new MySQL skills are. Having said all of that, we are now ready to truly start this project. Our first step is to make sure that our computer has 2 free tools installed that we'll need. The first tool that you'll need is called Visual Studio Code. So this is the official website. Please note the difference that we're not talking about the program called Visual Studio. There's a different program called Visual Studio Code. I'll include a link to this as a resource in this Udemy lesson, but this program is entirely free. It won't cost you anything to download and use forever. Right on the homepage, you can see it's free, it's built on open source, and it runs everywhere. So Mac, Windows, and Linux. So right now, go ahead and pause this video lesson while you go and download and install this program, Visual Studio Code. Once your download finishes, you should be able to just double-click the downloaded install file, and all of the default options are perfect. So you should be able to just click Next, Next, Next through the installation. So feel free to pause this video lesson right now while you go do that. When you come back and resume this video, you should now have Visual Studio Code installed, and the program will look something like this. Big picture, this is the program we're going to use to edit existing code files, right? We're going to type MySQL queries into existing programming files. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we actually get any work done, there's one other tool we need to make sure that our computer has installed, and that's something called Nodejs. So this is the official website. I'll include a link resource to this in the Udemy lesson. What in the world is Nodejs? Well, remember when we set the scene, we said that you're going to be imagining that you're sitting side by side a coworker, and they're the web developer, and you're the MySQL expert person. Well, that web developer coworker of yours, they programmed the entire skeleton of the server to use Nodejs. In other words, the example social media app that we're going to be working on, it's written in the language of Nodejs. So if we want to be able to work on it, we need to make sure that our computer can speak that language. But right now, I need you to pause the video lesson and go and get Nodejs installed. From the homepage, there are two download options: the long-term support version and the absolute newest bleeding edge version. Either version will work just fine, but I always recommend the long-term support version. Now, please note that when you're watching this video lesson in the future, your version numbers here do not need to match exactly what you're seeing on the screen right now. Every few weeks or months, these numbers are going to change as slightly newer versions are released, but I'll make sure that our code example files in this course continue to work with these newest versions. So go ahead and download this file. And again, all of the default options when you open that downloaded file are A-OK. So you should be able to just click Next, 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 and get this program installed. So go ahead and pause the video lesson and go get Nodejs installed. Once you come back and resume this video lesson, let's make sure that Node was successfully installed. Here's how you can do that. Open up your Visual Studio Code program and then open up your terminal. To open your terminal, you can click the View menu at the very top of the screen and then choose the Terminal option. Or if you like keyboard shortcuts, on Windows you can press Control-J. On Mac, you can press Command-J, and that will toggle your terminal opened and closed. Cool. With your terminal open, just click down there to make sure your cursor is down there, and you can see that now you can start typing down there. So to make sure that Node was successfully installed, just type this command in with me. Type in Node, and then a space, dash, dash, so two minus signs or two dashes, and then no more space, just dash, dash, version, all squished together. Go ahead and press enter. And your version number doesn't need to match mine as long as you see any sort of version number instead of command not found or unknown command. That means you have successfully installed Node. If you do indeed see unknown command, you might try just fully restarting your computer and then trying this again to see if it's working at that point. Big picture, as long as you see any sort of Node version number here, you're good to go and we are ready to move forward. In our next lesson, we are going to get truly up and running and working on the database aspect of this social network application. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to set up a brand new empty database that will be used for our social network app. Let's jump right into the action. For this first part of the video, I want you to open up MySQL Workbench. Now in the left-hand side, we see the two databases that we've been working on throughout the course, Pet Foods and Pet Foods Reference. Well, right now, let's go ahead and create a brand new separate database. So if you just right-click down in the empty space, you can choose Create Schema. Remember, schema is just another word for database, so Create Schema. You can name this database anything you want. Just make it something you can remember and type in again very easily. I'll call it maybe just Our Node App. Okay, let's click Apply in the bottom right corner. From this review screen, click Apply. We can close that screen. We can close this screen. Cool. So we now have this totally empty new database, and the idea here is that our social network Node.js application is going to use this to store its data. Before we try to get that application actually up and running, let's make sure that we're giving it access to this database in a secure way. And what I mean by that is I don't want that social network application to be able to access all of our databases. So I don't want it to be able to access pet foods or pet foods reference. I want to give it specifically only access to this one new database. To accomplish this, I want you to click on this administration menu that I'm highlighting right about here. So instead of the schema screen that we've usually been on, we're going to click on administration. We have all sorts of new options here. From this screen, I want you to click on users and privileges. So here we see a list of the current or existing users. Remember, we have our root user. I gave mine a password of root. You might have chose something different, but the idea is we don't want to use our root user and password to connect to the database from our social network application. And that's because it has full and complete access and permission to every database on our server. And the general rule of thumb, not just in databases, but just in internet security in general, is you don't want to give someone super ultra permissions if it's not necessary. So we want to create a new user here that only has permission for that new database we just created. This is actually a good skill to have because even if you weren't programming an application, even if you just wanted to give a friend or a coworker access to your database, right? Maybe they need to write a report on the pet foods reference database. You could create a new user here, name them, friend number 1 or guest number 2, give them a secure password, and then only give them access to certain tables in that database or even certain permissions. For example, you could say they're not allowed to create new rows or delete existing rows. They're only allowed to read or load the existing data. The possibilities here are limitless. Anyways, at this point, let's go ahead and create a new user. So right below this list of users, it's falling off the bottom of my screen, but down right below this area, you'll see a button called Add Account. So right now, click on that Add Account button. Okay, so now we see this new user. Let's change the name. You can choose any made-up name you want. Maybe I'll make up a name of Node App User. Next, we need to choose a password. Now, because we're not actually deploying this onto the internet, so hackers can't even attempt to hack us, we don't need to choose anything ultra secure. So just for the purposes of this course, I'll choose a password of QWERTY. Just make sure you type in something that you can easily remember. You're going to need this value in a minute or two. Go ahead and confirm your password in this field. Okay, next we want to click on this area called Schema Privileges. In other words, database privileges. So if you click on that menu, this area lists all the databases that this user has access to and then the specific actions or privileges that they have for that database. So we need to add something here. There's nothing here. So let's click Add Entry. This screen is asking us which databases are you trying to give this user access to. So we definitely don't want to grant access to all of them. Let's use this option, Selected Schema, and then from this drop-down menu, just choose the new database we created a moment ago. So I named mine Our Node App. Okay, click OK in the bottom right corner. Okay, and now with this row here selected, we need to choose which specific actions or operations or privileges we want to grant that user. So this is what I was talking about earlier when I said maybe you want a guest or coworker to only have sort of read access where they can select data, but they can't add in data or delete existing data. You get the idea. So you're giving them specific privileges. In this case, since this user needs to power, the automatic actions of the whole social network app, let's just give it all permissions. But the idea here is that it's just for this one database. Anyways, instead of manually clicking and checkboxing all of these, there is a button towards the bottom right corner of your screen that says Select All. I'll click that. You can see it checks everything except Grant Option, and that's okay. We don't need Grant Option. That would just let us change the privileges that other users have. We don't need that. We just need sort of the basic database operations that you see here. So now we're finally ready to move forward. You can click Apply in the very bottom right corner. There will not be any sort of review pop-up screen. It will just immediately create that new user. Let's test out that new user and password and try to actually log into Workbench using that new account. To do this, you can click the home icon in the top left corner of Workbench, or in Workbench, you can always use the View menu at the top and click Home. So throughout this course, we've been reusing this connection here, right? Every time you open up Workbench, you click here to connect, and that was using our root user that has access to everything. So right now, let's create a new connection that tests our new user. So I would just click this plus symbol icon right here. Just for our own readability, we can give this connection a name. Let's call it new user test. All of these default values in terms of the host and the port number, those are fine, but we do need to change the username. So whatever you just typed a minute ago as your new username, I chose a username of node app user. And then for the password, I'll click store in keychain, just enter whatever password you chose a moment ago. I chose QWERTY, click OK. Okay, then in the bottom right corner, I'll click OK. So now we have two connections to choose from when we open Workbench. Let's try to actually connect using the new one. So if I click on that and open up my sidebar, cool, notice I only have access to that one new database. We do not see pet foods or pet foods reference. Perfect. Now that we have not only this new database, but a new username and password to connect to it with, we are perfectly set up in our very next lesson to actually start connecting the Node application to this database and to begin to write real-world queries. I think this is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be sort of an aha moment to see how MySQL is used sort of remotely or externally in the real world. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're actually going to connect the dots between that new empty database we just set up and our simple social networking application. Now, remember when we set the scene for this project? We said that actually becoming a web developer is outside the scope of this course. So you're imagining that you're working with a coworker and they're the web developer and you're the MySQL expert. In other words, you and I in this course, we are not programming the entirety of the application. We're just going to write the SQL queries. So with that in mind, what I need you to do right now is look in the downloadable resources in Udemy for this lesson, and you should see a downloadable file named example app or exampleapp.zip. This contains the skeleton of our social networking app. It's just missing SQL queries. So go ahead and pause the video lesson right now while you download and then find this file on your computer, and then go ahead and extract the zip file. On Mac, you can just double click the zip file. On Windows, you can just right click on it and choose extract here or extract this file. So you can see I just extracted it. Now I have this folder named example app. And if you look inside it, you should see subfolders such as controllers, models, public, views, so on and so forth. So if you want to, you can leave this folder in your downloads folder. This folder can exist anywhere on your computer. Just make sure it's somewhere that you can easily find again in the future. Okay, but the question becomes, what do I want you to do with this folder? Well, I want you to open it up using the Visual Studio Code program from a couple of lessons ago. There are a few different ways to do this. So you could use the File Open menu in VS Code, or what I like to do and what I recommend is just literally dragging and dropping this example app folder on top of your VS Code program. So if I just release that, click, drag, and drop, cool. You know that you successfully opened that entire example app folder with VS Code if now on the left-hand side you see a list of all of the files and folders in that example app folder. In other words, once you see controllers, models, node modules, public, and views in your VS Code window like this, you'll know that you're at the right place. At this point in VS Code or Visual Studio Code, I want you to open up the db.js file in that folder. So here I can see it in VS Code. If you just click it once or double click it to fully open it, here we see the contents of that file. I want to draw your attention to lines number 7, 8, and 9. Now again, considering the scope of this course, our goal here is not to become a web developer and understand all of the code on the screen right now. But I do need you to pay attention to just these 3 values in this file. Big picture, all of the code in this file is trying to create a connection to our MySQL database server. And in order for it to succeed, these values need to make sense. So remember in our previous video when we created that new user in MySQL Workbench? Well, if you named that user something other than node app user, you would need to change this. You can just delete it and use whatever value you actually chose in the previous video. Do the same thing with your password, and then also whatever you specifically named that new empty database. So for example, in my Workbench, you can see, remember I named it our node app. So that's what I have in this file, but feel free to change these values to your specific case. And don't forget, as soon as you're happy with the values you typed in here, be sure to save this file. So that's Control-S on Windows, Command-S on Mac, or you can use the top file menu in VS Code and just click Save. Anyways, assuming these values are correct, let's try to actually launch or start running this web application. To do that, we just open up our command line or our terminal. Remember, to do that, you can either use the View menu at the very top of VS Code and then click Terminal, or remember the keyboard shortcut is Control-J on Windows or Command-J on Mac to open and close and toggle your terminal. Anyways, just click down in your terminal so you can start typing down there, and type this in with me. npm, and then a space, and then the word start. So npm start. Go ahead and press enter. And now, assuming you typed in these values perfectly correct, so they are case sensitive and you cannot even be a single letter off, but assuming you used the correct values, in your web browser, open up a new tab, and in the address bar, visit localhost:3000. So as soon as I press enter to visit that URL, you should now see this web application. Really quick, I do want to mention a common troubleshooting fix. So if in your terminal, when you ran npm start, you saw an error message down here that said something about port already busy or port already in use. Well, let me show you the solution to that. So you would not change this value on line number 6. You want to leave this to 3306. However, you would change this value down on line number 15. And just to be clear, if your application showed up here in your browser, you do not need to make this change. But there's an infinite number of computer programs you might have installed that I don't have installed, and maybe one of those programs that you have that I don't have is already trying to use up port 3000. So in that case, if you're running into that problem, maybe just try changing this value here down on line 15, where it says app.listen. Maybe change this to port 4000 like this. If you hit save, so Command-S or Control-S, that will automatically restart the server. So now back in the browser, I won't be able to visit localhost:3000. It would be :4000. I'm actually going to put that back to 3000 really quick just so we're all on the same page. But if you ran into that problem, I would give that a try. So let me put that back in the browser to 3000. Cool. At this point, let's talk about what in the world you and I are going to be doing in these files and folders here. And actually, if you can view the website in your browser tab, you can go ahead and close this db.js file. Really, out of all these files, the only ones that you need to work on are going to be in this models folder. So if we click on this arrow to sort of open up or inspect that models folder, you can see it contains 3 files: follow.js, post.js, and user.js. So this is where all of the database logic and SQL queries will live. Now, at this point, I've already written the user.js file for us. So I've already written all of the SQL queries when it comes to registering a user, storing the user's information and email address in our database, so on and so forth. However, I have not written any of the SQL queries for creating a post, editing a post, deleting a post, nor have I written any of the queries for following one user or unfollowing that user or populating your homepage feed of all the posts from users you follow. So that's what you and I are going to be doing together. For example, if you click on this post.js file, I don't expect you to understand any of this code. This is not a course about computer programming. So remember the situation that you're imagining. You're working with a coworker who's the web developer and you're the MySQL expert. But within this file, if you scroll down to about line number 64 or 65, here's what I want to draw your attention to. So we see it says task number 1, create a post. So throughout these two files, post.js and follow.js, if you scroll through them, you will see different, task number 1, task number 2. And then immediately below this commented out area that says task number whatever, you'll see db.execute, and then it's blank. There's nothing in these parentheses. Well, that is where a SQL query should be. So throughout the next several lessons, you and I are going to be writing these out together. Now, for this video, we're just worried about getting the application up and running in the browser at all. So we're not going to worry about writing a query in this video, but to close out the video, and just to show you that this application is truly connecting to our database, remember, I said that I already wrote the user.js queries for us. So, in your browser, you should be able to successfully register a user account. Now, I do want to say that this application is not connected to the internet. You're the only person in the world that can visit this address and this web application. It only exists in your personal private computer as your own little private sandbox. So don't feel like you're registering for some weird new account out on the internet. This is just a hypothetical educational test. So right now, I encourage you to sign up for an account so that we can practice actually doing things with that account, creating posts, following users in our upcoming videos. So I'll pick a username of Brad. You don't need to enter a real email address. You can just enter Brad at, whatever.com. Or you can just make up your own name at whatever.com. The application will force you to at least enter something that looks like a formatted email address, right? So some sort of value at something.com. Okay, then create a password. It needs to be at least 12 characters long. So I'll use QWERTY, and then go ahead and sign up. Cool, so hello, and then your username, your feed is empty. This worked because I already wrote the SQL queries in terms of creating a user account. Now to bring things full circle, if you open up MySQL Workbench, and you might need to click the refresh icon, but here you can see I just have that one database that this user has access to, our Node app. Now, if we look under tables, there's one called sessions, there's one called users. I want to draw your attention to the users table. So if you click this icon to view all of the rows in that table, as you might have guessed, there's a user. Aha, the username is Brad. There's the email address. Now, the password value is interesting. I used the value of QWERTY as my password, but that's not what we're seeing here in the database. And that's because it's never a good idea to store your users' passwords in plain text like that. Now, again, this is not a course about computer programming. We're just worried about MySQL. But essentially, I used something called bcrypt to hash the real password. And when you hash a value, it's not like you're encrypting it, because something that's encrypted can be decrypted. But there is no unhashing or dehashing a value once it's been hashed. So a metaphor is like if you took a piece of paper and burned it into a bunch of ashes, there's no way to reassemble those ashes back into the piece of paper where you could actually read what was written on the piece of paper. Long story short, even though we're not learning about application programming in this course, I wanted to talk about that because if you're working with databases, I don't ever want you to store users' real passwords in plain text. If you ever see a real human readable value here in your database for the password, you've made a huge mistake. And that's because if your database ever gets leaked, well, you just ruined the lives potentially of thousands of users. Anyways, back to the task at hand. So I've already written those queries that let you register and sign up, but everything else on the website is currently broken or empty because we need to write the queries for it. So for example, if I try to click this create post button, and then try to actually fill in the values and click save new post, it doesn't work. The server crashes, it runs into an error, and that's because it's missing that necessary SQL query to make it happen. Now, filling in those queries is exactly what we're going to start working on together in the next video. Now, really quick, if you don't have time to jump into the next video right now, I do want to show you how you can stop this web application. So back in VS Code, remember it's Control-J or Command-J to open up your terminal. You can see my application crashed because I tried to do something that we don't have a query for yet. But the point here is if you want to tell your application to stop running, in the command line, just click down here and press Control-C. So simultaneously, the Control key and the C key on your keyboard, that will stop the web server. So now in the browser, you can no longer visit it. Cool. So now you're safe to, turn off your computer and you don't need to worry that this application is wasting computer resources. Cool. In our very next lesson, we're going to start writing queries together. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to work on the posts table in our social network application. Let's jump right into the action. So at the very end of our previous lesson, I closed down the web application server so I can no longer visit it by visiting localhost :3000. Let's practice launching the server again so that you can visit it. If you still have the example app folder open in Visual Studio Code, that's perfect. If you don't, remember you can just drag and drop the example app folder on top of the VS Code program window. Anyways, within VS Code, as long as you see the files and folders of example app right here, that means VS Code is pointed towards the correct overall folder. So to launch the server up, you just open your terminal. So that's either the view menu at the top and click terminal, or Control-J or Command-J to toggle it open. And then the command you type down here is npm start. Go ahead and press enter. And now back in your web browser, you can indeed visit localhost :3000. Cool. Now in our previous video, we registered a user account, so you can log back in if you got logged out here. So this simple social media app is about creating posts, right? Where you provide a title and some body content. So in this video, let's create the posts table in our database. To do that, let's jump into the MySQL Workbench program, and I'm going to use that new user test connection, right? That uses the user that only has access to the one database of our Node app. So inside that database, if we look in tables, we have sessions and users. You and I didn't manually or directly create these tables. Instead, the program code from our social network application, it automatically created these for us. Don't worry, in a few lessons from now, you and I will indeed learn how to programmatically or automatically create tables like that. But for now, let's not worry about that. For now, let's go ahead and create a new table called posts. So we'll right-click on tables, choose create table. Right here, let's give it the name of posts, and then let's start choosing our columns. So for the first column, hypothetically, you could name this anything, but because the application code has already been written, I want you to give it this exact name so that you and I are on the same page and your MySQL code works with the application code. Essentially, I want you to name this, instead of just ID, I want you to name it _ID. There's no technical reason for this. You can imagine that this is just to play nicely with your coworker, the web developer. Maybe it's their personal preference that this is named _ID. You can create this character on your keyboard by holding the Shift key and then it's 2 keys to the left of your backspace or delete button. So _ID, the data type will be int. Let's make this not null, and indeed let's make it the primary key as well. Let's set it to auto increment. Okay, next, let's create a column and name it title. For the data type, why don't we make this medium text, not null. New column. This will be the body content. So let's just name the column body. For the data type, let's choose long text, not null. Next column, we need to keep track of who created the post. So let's name this column author. And this will just be a foreign key that points to the user ID, right? So it'll point towards the users table. So for the data type, that would be int, not null. We can set up the foreign key for that in just a minute. Let's continue creating the columns. So let's have another column called created date. And for the data type, I will choose date time. Choose not null. Let's go ahead and actually create this table now. So in the bottom right-hand corner, it's falling off the edge of my screen, but go ahead and click the apply button. From the review screen, click apply again. We can close this screen. Now that we've created the table, let's take a minute to talk about the foreign key for the author column. So setting up that foreign key is optional. It's up to you. As we learned back in the foreign key lesson, they're not absolutely necessary, but I do think they're a good idea, so we might as well add one. So from this same screen where we were creating the table, remember you can always get back to this screen by using the wrench icon next to the table here. Well, towards the bottom of this screen, there's an item called foreign keys. Let's click on that. Let's make up a name. I'll name it author FK for author foreign key. This column will contain a value that points back to the users table, right? The user ID. So the referenced table would be our users table. However, Mysql Workbench has a bug, and if the table you're trying to point towards has a generated virtual column, well, the graphical user interface of Mysql Workbench won't let you point towards any of those columns. So if I tried to check the checkbox for author and then, try to choose one of the columns from the users table, they just don't show up at all. Now, this is not a real restriction in MySQL. It's just a bug in SQL Workbench. So the way around this that I've found is to just temporarily choose a reference table that we don't actually mean. So for example, it wouldn't make any sense to try to point towards the same table we're already in, but just set this reference table to posts for just a minute, then check the checkbox for the author column, say that the referenced column is _ID, and now click the apply button in the bottom right-hand corner. And now before you click apply again, we are free to modify this code that MySQL is actually going to run. So at the end of the day, all the Workbench application is really doing is setting up skeleton code for us that we could have written on our own. So really all we need to change is this line that says references our node app dot and then the table name. Instead of posts here, this should be users. Once you make that change, now we can go ahead and click apply in the bottom right corner. Cool. At this point, we can close this table setup screen. And now let's use this icon to view all of our posts. We don't currently have any, so let's work on creating one. This is where our experience from the course so far is going to help us. So we know how to do this. We would just write a statement where you say insert into the posts table, one set of parentheses, values, another set of parentheses. So first we spell out the columns. We wouldn't need to spell out the auto-incremented ID value, but we would want to provide a title, comma, body content, comma, author, comma, created date. Just so it fits on the screen, you could drop down before the word values, and then in these parentheses, let's give it a made-up title, so quotes of created from Workbench, comma. For the body content, let's just say lorem ipsum, comma. For the author, well, we only have one user in our users table, right? So I created a Brad user. I'm sure you created a different name. But the idea is if you look in your users table, there's only one user and they have an ID of 1. So that's who we're saying authored or created this post, comma. And then for the created date, we can just call the MySQL function of now and a set of parentheses to call it. Cool. So let's go ahead and run this. Whoops, I actually got an error message, and this has more to do with Workbench than working with MySQL in general, but we need to specify which database we're talking about when we're spelling out the table name. So you could manually type out your database name .posts, or what you can do in Workbench is just right-click on the database here. So mine is named Our Node App. Right-click and choose Set as Default Schema. And now Workbench will correctly assume that that's the database we're talking about when we reference a table name. So if I run this query again, cool. Now if I go look at all of my posts, perfect. But you and I have added a row to a table before, so that wasn't super new and exciting. But what would be new and exciting is to have that happen through an action in our web application. So when you click the green Create Post button, at the moment, if you tried to actually submit this form, you'd get an error message, but we just need to fill in the MySQL query to actually save whatever values someone enters here. So let's do that. In Visual Studio Code, in the left-hand sidebar, I want you to look in the Models subfolder, and I want you to jump into the file named post.js. Within this file, scroll down to about line number 65. So we see task number 1, create a post. And then this line in particular, line 68, we see db.execute. Now, in these parentheses, it's currently empty. We're going to give it two things. So just for a placeholder, let's say A, B. Now, what are these two things we're going to give it? Well, the first thing, so instead of this placeholder A, we just give it a MySQL query. In other words, get rid of the A placeholder before the comma and add in a pair of quotes. And now inside those quotes, just go back into MySQL Workbench, and then back in this tab where we just wrote this query to insert a row into the post table, just select everything in that query, copy it into your clipboard, and then back in VS Code, paste that inside these quotes here. Now in JavaScript, within a traditional string of text, which is what we have when we have just double quotes like this, you're not allowed to drop down to a new line. And remember in Workbench, we dropped down just so it fits on the screen before the word values. So to fix that, right before the word values here, I'll just backspace so it's not actually dropping down to a separate line. Okay, but now the question becomes, well, what is this second value here? Why did we add this B placeholder? So after the query, comma, B, what goes here? Well, for the remainder of this lesson, I want to talk about basic security when it comes to real-world applications and a MySQL database. In other words, within this query that we just pasted in, we wouldn't actually want to hard code the title value to created from Workbench, right? We would want to dynamically use whatever value the visitor in the web browser typed into this title field. However, rule number 1 in any sort of software development is, unfortunately, you have to assume that every user of your product is evil. Let me explain what I mean. So our first instinct back in the code might be to just learn a little bit about JavaScript and the syntax that we're programming with here, and sort of just mix those incoming values from the user into the query. For example, when we see here the comment, task number 1, create a post. And then here we see you'll need, and I've made those real dynamic incoming values available from these names. So incoming.title, incoming.body, so on and so forth. So you might think, well, let's just sort of hollow out this query and replace created from Workbench with incoming.title. Well, while that general idea of wanting to substitute it with a dynamic value, while that is ultimately what we're going to do, we need to be very careful in the way that we do that. If we're not careful, we will absolutely fall victim to something called a SQL injection attack. What in the world is a SQL injection attack? Well, for the next minute or two, let's just pretend that you and I are evil hackers. So back in Workbench, open up a new tab, and let's type this in. So first we'll start with something innocent. Imagine someone loads a URL in our web application to view a specific post. So this is just an innocent query, right? Select all columns from the posts table where underscore ID equals 1. If we run that query, cool. That gets us the first post with that matching ID. The idea here, though, is that this ID number that we're looking for, that would be coming dynamically from whichever URL or individual post someone's trying to view, right? This wouldn't be hard-coded to this number of 1. This would be dynamic. Now, if we're not careful about the way we use dynamic values, we'll fall victim to something called a SQL injection attack. And here's what that would look like. Imagine if we literally just trusted whatever someone typed in for the requested value here. Well, if that person was a normal, valuable member of society, they'd probably type in something normal or useful like, the number 5 or the number 20. But what if that person was a degenerate? They typed in something like, 1 semicolon, and then they could do anything. They could delete all of our tables, or they could create false records. So just as an example, I'll paste this in, right? So imagine they're inserting a post into the post table with the title of haha hacked, and maybe they can create that on behalf of any user in the website. Or imagine if they just deleted all posts in all of our tables or dropped all the tables. The point is what if we literally just trusted the entire incoming value here? In other words, if we're not careful about the way we blend in or merge in the dynamic values into our query, watch what happens. So if I just replace that innocent value of 1 with 1 semicolon, the malicious content, if I run this query, well, as you might have expected, if we go into the post table, there's the haha hacked row. So the question becomes, how do we protect ourselves against a SQL injection attack like that? Right? Because ultimately we do need to use incoming dynamic values from other people. Well, there are several ways to protect against this, but I think the best option is to use something called a prepared statement. Before we even talk about what a prepared statement is, let's first just talk about the obvious problem, right, that we're trying to solve. And the problem is that we don't want to blend together or have there be any confusion between the logic or the skeleton structure of our query and the actual values in our query, right? The program logic should be totally separate from the actual content or values. If there's any sort of ambiguity or confusion between the two, you open yourself up to an injection attack. This is why a prepared statement in MySQL is so great. With a prepared statement, you send along your query totally separate from the actual values. Let me explain. So back in Visual Studio Code, remember how we had this second placeholder of B? Well, that's because we're going to use a prepared statement. So in this first value, which is our query, this is sort of the overall skeleton, the logic of our query. But then a completely separate value will be the actual dynamic values. And then it's up to MySQL to handle merging the two together, but we will have eliminated any possible confusion. MySQL will know that whatever we include here is just a value and should not be interpreted or parsed, as an actual MySQL command in and of itself. At this point, let's hollow out the query or make it flexible. So with the prepared statement, instead of this hard-coded value of, the title created from Workbench, we get rid of that, including the quotes wrapped around it, and instead, you just include a question mark. So the question mark lets MySQL know, hey, in this prepared statement, this is where a value is going to be placed. It's just a placeholder. So then we would do that with all of these. So instead of quotes lorem ipsum for the content, it would just be a question mark. Instead of the user ID that's the author, it would just be a question mark. Instead of calling now, it would just be a question mark. So we're giving MySQL this query, right? We've spelled out the columns we want to add values for. We've provided just sort of empty placeholders for those values. And then this second thing that we're sending, right? So comma, and then instead of the B placeholder, well, this gets into a bit of programming and JavaScript syntax instead of just MySQL. But we're going to send an array. So in JavaScript, you create an array with an opening square bracket, closing square bracket. So you'll find these characters to the right of the P key on your keyboard. An array is just a collection of multiple things. So inside the array, the first thing we're going to include, remember the order of the columns and the placeholders would be incoming.title, comma. The second thing we're providing would be the body content, so incoming.body, comma, and then the author, so incoming.author, comma, and then finally the date, so incoming.createdDate. Let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So Control S or Command S to save this file. So now back in our browser, let's actually fill out this create post form screen. So I'll give it a title of created from web browser. For the content, I'll say testing 1, 2, 3. Now, I will point out that when I click save new post, we're going to get an error message because we haven't written the query to display or load post content. But since we have written the query to actually create that new row in the table, this should work. So go ahead and click save new post. There's the error message that I was expecting. But if we go back into Workbench and refresh this view to show all of our posts, perfect. We now have this brand new post created from web browser, and it's using those dynamic values that we just typed in. In our very next lesson, we're going to continue writing additional queries so that you can actually view or load a post, maybe update an existing post, start deleting posts, so on and so forth. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to work on reading, updating, and deleting posts in our social network application. Let's jump into the action. So in our previous video, we set up the query so that if you click create post and then actually fill in this form, yes, you'll get an error message because then the website would try to display the post that you just created. And we haven't written the query for that yet, but we did successfully write the query that actually creates a new post. So let's pick up right where we left off. Let's start writing those queries that can read, edit, and delete existing posts. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, remember to get this web application up and running, you just need to use Visual Studio Code, open up the command line, and your command line does indeed need to be pointing towards your example app folder. But assuming that it is, you can just run the command of npm start. As soon as you do that, you can then visit localhost :3000 in your web browser. Cool. Now to start writing the new queries back in Visual Studio Code, in the left-hand sidebar, let's jump into the models folder and then go into the file named post.js. Scroll down to about line number 104 and you should see task number 2, update an existing post. And then right below that instructions area, you'll see db.execute. So just like in our previous video, in these empty set of parentheses here within execute, let's provide 2 placeholders, so A, B. We're going to be giving MySQL 2 separate values because we're using a prepared statement, right? So the first value will be sort of the hollowed out query itself. This second value will be an array with the actual values. Now, in terms of the actual query itself, let's start out in Workbench and we can practice writing out the query and we can test it to make sure that it works. But first, let's give ourselves an imaginary goal, a hypothetical goal. So if we view all of our existing posts with this icon, imagine we want to write a query that updates the post that has an ID of 2 and we want to change the title and body content. Well, to make that happen, and you can type this in with me in a new tab in Workbench, we would just say update something in the posts table, and we would want to set the title column to equal some sort of new value. So let's say quotes, maybe just hello test. After that, comma, we would also want to set the body column to have a new value. Let's just say test again. And then at the end of this query, we need to be a bit more specific. We don't want to do this for every single row in the table. We only want to perform these actions where, or I'll actually drop down just so it fits on the screen, but where underscore ID equals 2, right? We just want to update that specific post. So if we go ahead and run this query and then switch back to this tab where we're actually viewing all of our posts and rerun it, cool. There's that new value of hello test and test again. So at this point, we just need to take this query and sort of hollow it out in VS Code. Now I'm going to adjust it so it sits all on a single line because that's what we need for JavaScript. And then just select the entire thing, so Control A or Command A, copy it into your clipboard. Then, back in Visual Studio Code, instead of this A placeholder here in DB execute, we would provide quotes. Inside the quotes, just paste in your clipboard. Okay, now we just need to hollow out the actual values. We don't want to hard code this to hello test as the title. So get rid of that, including those single quotes, and just replace it with a question mark. And then this body value, do the same thing, get rid of that value, just a question mark. Same thing with this. We wouldn't want to hard code the ID to 2. That would just be a question mark. Cool, so now we just need to update this B placeholder. So instead of B, it would be an array. In JavaScript, that's just the square brackets. So the first value that we provide would be the title value. So that's incoming.title, comma, incoming.body, and then finally, comma, incoming.requestedPostID. And we need a bit of attention to detail here. So the P in post is capitalized, and the I in ID is capitalized. Cool. Now before we save this file and test it out, let's also write the query. So if you just scroll down a little bit in this file, down to line number 118, you'll see task number 3, find one post by its ID. So this query is going to be used for all sorts of things in the application. URLs are screens that are trying to view or load a single post, but also a lot of other actions that first need to check to make sure that the person trying to modify a post is actually the author or owner of that post. Now at first glance, this might look like the world's easiest query in history to write, right? We just need to select a post where the ID equals something. However, we do also need to join on to the users table. And that's because if you look at your posts table in Workbench, yes, it contains the title and the content, but on a real website, you also want to display the username of the person who created the post, maybe their avatar, right? You need information about the person who created the post. If you think about Facebook or Twitter, obviously they're going to display a little bit of user data on a post screen or a tweet screen. So let's write the query that selects a post based on its ID, but then also joins on a bit of information about the author of that post. So in a new tab, here's what I would write. Let's start with everything. So select all columns from the posts table. Right after posts, let's make it also available just with the letter P so it's easy to type. And then let's join the users table and let's make that available just with the letter U on the condition that p.author equals user._ID. Okay, now instead of dropping down so it fits on the screen, I'm just going to scroll a little bit. I want to stay on a single line so it's easy to copy and paste into JavaScript in just a minute. But we'd want to end by saying where p._ID equals, and let's temporarily hard code this to just 1 or 2, just for a quick test. So if we run this query, cool. So we have the title, the content, but then we also have the username, and if you scroll over a bit to the right, the avatar. If you're curious how your web developer coworker is generating this avatar or this little photo, it's simply based on whatever email address you provided for this user account. So if you really want a photo to appear in this hypothetical application, you can just go to gravatar.com and sign up with whatever email address your user account is using here. That's completely a tangent, it's just for fun, but anyways, moving on. At this point, let's be a little bit more selective in terms of just selecting every single column, because there's no need for the database layer of this application to pass on the password, right, to any other part of the application here. We're just trying to look up information about a post. It would be reckless or unnecessary, even though this is a hashed value, it just doesn't have anything to do with the task at hand. So let's be more specific with what we're selecting. So instead of the asterisk, let's select p.title, comma, p.body, comma, p._ID, comma p.author, comma p.createdDate, comma u.username, comma, and finally u.avatar. Let's rerun the query. Cool. So now we just have the actual information that we truly need. If this is hard to follow along with and type with me, that's okay. I'll provide a copy and paste resource for this query at the end of the lesson. At this point though, let's select everything in this query. So just Command or Control A and then copy it into our clipboard and then back in Visual Studio Code on line 121. Well, in these empty parentheses, let's say A comma B. For the first value, instead of A, it would just be quotes, paste in our clipboard. And really, the only thing we need to hollow out is the specific post that we're looking for. So instead of hard coding that to 2, it would just be a question mark. Okay? Then, instead of the placeholder B, we would give it an array, so square brackets. Inside those brackets, the only thing we need to provide is simply ID. If you're wondering how you're supposed to know the name of this incoming value, well, in the comments section for each one of our tasks, your web developer coworker has told you what you'll need, right? And that includes the name of the values. At this point, let's go ahead and save this file in Visual Studio Code. So that's Control S or Command S. That'll automatically restart the web server using the newest code. Now, if in the application you tried to visit your profile, you'll see an error screen. So for example, I just clicked on my profile, that crashed the server, and that's because we still haven't written the query that loads all posts based on an author's ID. So if you crash the server, don't worry, you just need to go into VS Code. In your command line, just press Control C, so the Control key on your keyboard, and simultaneously the C key, and then just start your server up again by running npm start. Okay, so now we know what we can and can't do. So if you go to the home page of localhost 3000, we can't go to our profile yet, but we can go to create post, and you can create a brand new post. So new post test, body content, lorem ipsum again. Now, if we actually save this post, we don't get an error message. We get new post successfully created because we just wrote the query that loads a post based on the incoming requested ID. So this brand new post has an ID of 4. You could go and look and find this in Workbench. And more importantly, you could update this or edit this through the web application. So if I click on this blue pencil edit icon, maybe I want to add a few exclamation points at the end of the title. And the same thing with my body content. And then click Save Updates down here at the bottom. Cool, that was successfully updated, and you can use this link to go back to sort of viewing that one individual post. Perfect. Now before we go ahead and work on the query that would let us click this red delete trash icon to actually delete a post, let's first write a couple queries that will let us actually view our profile without crashing the server. Because our profile screen has a useful list of links to all the posts we've created. So let's focus on that first. So back in VS Code, scroll down to about line number 134. So task number 4, find all posts by author ID. This query is going to be very similar to the previous one we wrote. So in order to save a lot of typing and work, I'm just going to scroll back up to task number 3, and let's just recycle and slightly adjust this code. Because this code already joins on the user data that's necessary, and it already selects the perfect columns. So there's no point in writing that out again. So what I would do is just select from db.execute. So we don't need any of this starter programming code, just db.execute, and then just copy the entire rest of that line of code. So I'll copy that into my clipboard. And then back down in task number 4, where we see db.execute. Again, keep this beginning part of the line of programming, but we can just get rid of db.execute, paste in our clipboard. So now again, it's db.execute, and now let's just slightly adjust things. So towards the very end of this query, we really just need to adjust the where clause. So instead of selecting a single post based on the post ID, we want to select any post that has a certain author ID value. So that would just be, instead of p.id, it would be p.author. And then while we're at it, I'll save us a bit of time and let you know that we would want to order them based on the date that they were created, and we'd want the newest posts to come first at the top. So before the closing quote string, right after this question mark, I would add on order by, and then the created date column, and then a space, and then order them in a descending fashion. Okay, then in terms of the array of values that we're sending to MySQL, right, and MySQL will know to use that value here, this wouldn't be ID, this would be author, uppercase I, and then lowercase d, so author ID. Cool. Before we save this file, let's write one more query that will allow the profile screen to actually work. So around line number 141, we see task number 5, count how many posts a user has created. So if you've ever visited Twitter, you know that towards the top of a user's profile, it says how many total tweets they have. So this is a similar feature. This is such a simple query, we don't even need Workbench. We can just spell it out right here. So within the empty db.execute parentheses, let's have a comma b. For the query itself, quotes, and we would just select, and then we can use the aggregate function in MySQL, the count function. So count parentheses, let's just count the underscore ID column. And just so this plays nicely with the other code that our web developer coworker has written, let's make this also available under the nickname, so as posts. Okay, but we'd be selecting that from the posts table where the author column has a value, so where that equals question mark. And then in terms of the actual value we'd pass in here, this would be an array, so just square brackets, and the value here is just simply ID. Let's go ahead and save this file and test it out. So back in the browser, if I try to click on my profile now, cool, the server doesn't crash. Instead, I see a list of all of my posts, and it says posts, colon, and it counts how many posts I've created. And I can click on any of these links. Perfect. I can click this link to go back to my profile. Cool. At this point, to close out this video, let's write the code that would let you actually click the red delete trash icon. So back in Visual Studio Code, scroll down to about line number 152, or I should say line 157 or 58. We see task number 6, delete one post by ID. So here we can see the dynamic value that our web developer coworker is giving us is called post ID to delete. I think we can skip Workbench again for this one because it's going to be a fairly simple query. So in these empty db execute parentheses, it would just be a comma b. Instead of a, it would be quotes, delete from the posts table where underscore ID equals question mark. And then which one do we actually want to delete? Well, instead of the b placeholder, it would be an array, square brackets, and then just this name that our web developer coworker told us we can use. So that's the incoming value, post ID to delete. And you can see the starting letter of each new word is capitalized. So the I in ID, the T in to, and the D in delete. Let's go ahead and save that and test it out. So back in the browser, I'll go back to my profile and imagine I want to delete this post called created from Workbench. I can just click on that, click the red trash icon. Cool, post successfully deleted. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our very next video, we're going to work on the live search functionality of the web app. Currently, if you click on this search icon and search for anything, you will crash the server. So, hello, the request failed. And now if I try to refresh, we see the server crashed. This is because, as you might have guessed, you and I need to write the SQL queries and indexing code to power that search. That's what we're going to work on in our very next lesson. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to set up the search functionality in our social network application. Let's jump into the action. So in our previous video, we saw that currently, if you try to use this live search feature, you crash the server, and that's because we haven't written the SQL statements to power that yet. Now, before we jump into Visual Studio Code and try to write that search query, let's not forget how important it is to have the right index in MySQL. So imagine we want someone to be able to type in a phrase into a single field here and have it search for posts based on both the title value and the body content value of posts. Really quick, let me jump into Workbench and show you what we would not want to do. So we could write a very simple query like this that doesn't even use an index. We could say select all columns from the posts table where the title is like quotes, percentage, and let's say we were searching for the word again. Remember back when we learned about full text indexes, we learned that this is an alternative approach, and if you don't have very many rows in a table, this is fine, but as soon as you have a table with lots and lots of rows, this type of searching can become very expensive and slow. And we would also want to search the body content, so we'd have to say or, and then if body is like, quotes, percentage, again, percentage, quotes. So if I go ahead and run this query, it gets the job done, right? It looked in both the title values and the body values for the word again. However, MySQL needed to perform a full table scan in order to get these results. And if this post table had 5 million rows in it, that could be a bit slow. So this is really just a refresher. We already learned about full text indexes earlier in the course. The correct tool for the job here is to set up a full text index, not only for the title column, but a compound index that is for both the title and the body columns. Let me show you how we can do that. So let's actually just close out this tab, and then in the left-hand sidebar, under Posts, click the wrench icon. Okay, then towards the bottom of the screen, click on Indexes. Currently, we just have 2 indexes for this table. We have our primary key, and then we have our foreign key for the author column. Let's create a brand new index, so click to edit. This label name doesn't really matter, it's just for our own readability. Why don't we name it Title Body Search? Okay, but then what does matter is the type of index. We want to set that to a full text index. So full text. Okay, now over in this area, we want to check the checkboxes for both title and body. I'm doing this because our application never needs to search for these individually. But if you were working on a different application where you would need to search for just the title value or just the body value, then you could create separate individual indexes for each. The Mysql Optimizer is pretty intelligent about looking at the options that are available to it when you run a query, and it will choose from the options that make the most sense. Obviously, you don't want to make too many different indexes or indexes that will hardly ever be used, because every time someone creates or edits a post, MySQL needs to update and maintain the indexes, which will take a little bit of extra time the more indexes there are to maintain. But if you genuinely have distinct different searches that your users are going to be using non-stop all the time, then it's worth that trade-off. Anyways, in our case, for this application, we only ever need to search for both of these things at the same time together. So a compound index like this makes sense. Let's go ahead and click the Apply button in the bottom right corner. From this review screen, click Apply again. We can close out this screen, we can close this screen. Now, in a new tab, let's practice leveraging that index. So we would say, select all columns from the posts table where, and then remember when you're using a full text index, you can use the match and the against functions. So in the match parentheses, you list the columns you're interested in. So title, comma, body, right? We're searching through both of those columns. MySQL will see this and recognize that, hey, I have an index for just this case. And then what are we searching against? Well, in these parentheses, just quotes, let's search for the word again. So if we run this query, perfect. We get the results that we would expect, and this time around, this solution makes sense even if this table had 3 million rows in it. This is the right tool for the job. At this point, now that we've created that index and refreshed our memory of the match against syntax, let's jump into Visual Studio Code and write this query for real. So in VS Code, in previous videos, we've gone over several times how to make sure that your VS Code is pointed towards your example app folder and that you have the application up and running so you can visit it at localhost:3000. But right now, we want to jump into the models folder and then the post.js file. In this file, scroll down to about line number 176. So you'll see task number 7, search for posts by keyword or phrase. So our web developer coworker is letting us know that the incoming dynamic value that the actual user is searching for is search term with an uppercase T for term. So right below this comment, we see the familiar db.execute with empty parentheses. Now, before we start typing, we can save a ton of typing by reusing one of our queries from up above, because we've already written the exact code that joins on the users table for the user's username, their avatar, and those queries also select the perfect columns instead of selecting everything. So to save a bunch of typing, I would scroll back up to about line number 118, where we see task number 3, find one post by its ID. So we're interested in this db.execute code. You don't need to select any of this beginning portion of the line of code. Just start selecting from the db.execute all the way to the end of the line, copy that into your clipboard, and now we can reuse that. So go back down to task number 7, right, which is our search functionality. Task 7, search for posts. So again, keep the beginning part of that line, but we can get rid of db.execute because we have that in our clipboard. So just paste that in. Cool. So we have db.execute once again. Now really all we need to change is the end of this query. So if you scroll to the right, here we see the where clause. So just get rid of everything that comes after the where clause, but obviously keep the closing quotes. And let's fill this in. So we'll say where, and then we want to match, parentheses to call that, against, parentheses to call that. In the match parentheses, it would be title, comma, body. In the against parentheses, it would just be a question mark. Speaking of that question mark, we're using a prepared statement, so we need to make sure that this second separate value here in this array, we'll get rid of ID. In those square brackets, it would instead be search term with the uppercase T for term. Cool. Let's go ahead and save this and test it out. So back in the browser, if I search for maybe the word browser, I searched for that because I knew I had a post titled created from the web browser. But if I search for lorem, I know that I had a post that used the phrase lorem ipsum in the body content. Cool. Or if I search for the word again, perfect. And feel free to click on any of these results and it will take you to that post. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we're going to start working on the ability to follow a different user. And then ultimately, once we have the follow functionality set up, that's what can power the homepage feed of the posts from the people you follow. This should be a lot of fun to set up. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you in the next lesson. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to set up the ability for one user to start following another user. Or in other words, how would we approach this from a database perspective? Let's jump into the action. So currently within our web application, I'm logged in with my Brad account. Let's actually go ahead and sign out. So the top right button. And let's register for a new secondary account. This way we can try to follow one user account with the other user account. So I'll make a new account. I'll name this user Barks a Lot. You can feel free to make up any fictional name, but just go ahead and enter a fake email address and enter a password. It needs to be at least 12 characters long, and then go ahead and sign up. Cool. Now that I'm logged in with this new user, let's try to search for a post from our original user. So if I search for, I know in my case, if I search for the word again, I'm going to find posts by the Brad user. So if I click on one of those posts, here's the individual screen for a post, but here you see posted by the username on the date. If you click on that username, that takes you to their profile. And so we want to make this follow button come to life. Currently, if I was to click on this button, it crashes the server. Cool. So just to prove to you, yep, it crashed the server. To start the server back up in VS Code, you can just open up your command line. So Control J or Command J, press Control C to completely stop the server, and then npm start to fire it up again. Cool. So let me go back. So our job in this video is to add this follow ability. So how would we model this relationship of following a user in the context of our database? Well, let's jump into Workbench. And as we learned way back in an earlier chapter, while our first instinct might be to go into the users table and add on extra columns called following user 1, following user 2, following user 3, right? And just store the user ID of the other user you're following, while you could technically make that work, it would be super limited, super inflexible, and super inefficient, right? Because what if one user is following 3,000 other users? We wouldn't want to have 3,000 columns, followed user 2,999. So as we learned in an earlier chapter, in these situations, it makes more sense to create a brand new separate table, and the sole job of that new table is to manage all of these different relationships. So right now, in the left-hand side of Workbench, I'm going to right-click on Tables, and let's choose Create Table. Let's name this brand new table Follows. All right, so each row in this table represents a single follow relationship. Okay, and let's start building out our columns. Now, there's no one right way to build a table, but I'm just going to explain my own thought process here. When I think of the way our application is going to work, I don't think we need a traditional single column primary key that gets auto-incremented. Because let's think about this for a minute. I can't think of a situation where we would preemptively know an ID of a follow record. Instead, we're always going to be searching for these follow rows based on the user that's doing the following or the user that's getting followed. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we don't really need that auto-incremented traditional single column primary key. So instead, here's what I'm going to do. Let's create one column and name it followed ID, and I capitalize the I in ID. So this would be the user ID of the person you are trying to follow. Okay, new column. Let's name the second column author ID, and again, uppercase I for ID. And this would be the person doing the following, or in other words, creating or authoring this follow row in the table. Let's change the data type to int. And then here's the interesting part. Let's also check the checkbox so that it is the primary key as well. So when you have multiple columns acting as your primary key like this, we would call this a composite primary key. Now remember, a primary key needs to be unique, and so I think this will work very nicely given the nature of a follow. In other words, you can only follow another user once. So this combination of the person that's doing the following and the person that's being followed, we want that combination to be guaranteed to be unique. Also, this way, we don't even need to waste the space of having a third column just storing some sort of unique primary key. We already needed these two columns anyways, so this just seems like an efficient solution. Before we actually create this table by clicking the Apply button in the bottom right corner, let's first set up our foreign keys. They aren't absolutely necessary, but it will ensure that the value you're including here does actually exist as a user ID row in the users table. So down here we can click on foreign keys. I'll make up a name here for the first one. The name doesn't matter, but I'll call it followed FK. Now, because our users table has a generated column for the avatar value, we're going to run into that same bug in Mysql Workbench where it won't let you select any columns from the users table. So my workaround is just to choose a different table that doesn't make any sense, and then we can fix which table it's pointing towards in the review screen. So just to bypass this bug in Workbench, I would maybe choose the posts table. Okay, so I'm creating the foreign key for the followed value. So I check the checkbox for followed ID. Say the referenced column is _ID. Okay, now let's create a separate foreign key for that other column. So remember, it was named author ID. Now, if we name this label for the foreign key author FK, we'll get an error because we've already used that as a label for a foreign key in the posts table. So we need a unique sort of readable label for this foreign key. How about we just call it author ID, the same thing as the column. It doesn't matter if you and I have different names for these foreign key labels anyways. But we do want to choose temporarily, even though it doesn't make logical sense, the posts table. We'll switch this in the review screen. Okay, this time around we check the checkbox for author ID. Yes, we want to point towards the _ID column. Now let's click the apply button in the bottom right corner. And from this review screen, we just need to change these two lines where it says references for the foreign key constraints. So this first one, references, we don't actually want to point towards the posts table. So I would delete that and replace it with the users table. Right? We're pointing towards the user ID of the person who's being followed. And then down here, this is the person doing the following. So again, we don't actually want the posts table. We want the users table. Cool. Let's go ahead and actually click the apply button in the bottom right corner. We can close this screen. We can close this setup screen. And let's actually start viewing all of our follow rows. So this icon near the follows table. Obviously, we don't have any follows yet, but let's try to add one. Instead of manually spelling out an insert statement, you can just click down here. So if you click in this empty column, double click. Let's say that user number 1 is getting followed by user number 2. So if we click apply right here, click apply on this review screen, cool, that operation went through. If you refresh this query to show all of your follows, well, we now still see that row. It was stored in the database. You could try it the other way around too. If you wanted to say that user number 2 is being followed by user number 1, that would work. But if you tried to include this unique combination again, it wouldn't go through because we set up a composite primary key. The combination of these two column values need to be unique. So if I tried to add another row where it was that user being followed by this user and click apply, and then actually try to run that, we receive an error message. That operation does not go through. Cool. Also, if you tried to follow a bogus user, so we know that this user ID doesn't actually exist in our database. If you try to have that go through, so if I actually apply that, that fails as well because of our foreign key checks. So we technically didn't need to set up all that extra logic with the composite primary keys and the foreign keys because our web developer coworker could manually add those checks in the programming logic instead of within our MySQL logic. So again, there's no one single right or wrong way to build something, but I do think it's nice to be able to include sort of this integrity or checks on the relationships directly from within MySQL like this. Now, before we actually start writing the queries that would run when a user clicks the follow button in the web application, let's first give ourselves a clean slate. Let me refresh this view. I'll delete, and I encourage you to do the same as well. Delete any practice or test rows you just added to the follows table. So you can just click on a row and then right click and choose delete row and then click apply. Or better yet, you could just write a statement like this. Delete from the follows table, and then we don't specify which ones we want to delete. We just want to delete all of them. So if you run this statement and then view all of the items in your follows table, cool, it's empty. That's going to bring this lesson to a close, but now in our very next lesson, with this table structure in place, we're perfectly set up to make this follow button come to life. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you then. Hello everyone. In our previous lesson, we set up the table structure for representing a follow relationship. So now in this lesson, we can actually start writing the queries that our web application can leverage. In other words, here you can see I'm signed in as my Barks-a-Lot user, but if I search for posts that I know will exist created by the Brad user and then visit their profile, we want to make this follow button come to life. So to do this, jump into Visual Studio Code. In the left-hand file and folder viewer, I want you to jump into the models subfolder and then open up the file named follow.js. And just like we saw in our post.js file, if you scroll down to about line number 18, you'll see task number 1, see if username exists. So essentially, our web developer coworker is giving us something called this.followedUsername, and they just want us to look in the database and see if that is a valid username. Does that username actually exist? So if it exists, we're just going to return that row, that username or that user account row. If it doesn't exist, we'll just return an empty data set, just nothing. And then the web developer's code will handle that accordingly. So right below the commented out area, just like always, we see await db.execute. So in these empty parentheses, let's provide a comma b because we're going to use a prepared statement. Instead of a for the actual query itself, double quotes. And this is a very basic query. We would just select, and in this case, I am okay just selecting all columns because we're not actually passing that on anywhere in the code. So we wouldn't be passing the hashed password from the user row anywhere else in the application. The only thing that's going to leave this block of code is the user account's ID, right? The user that's going to get followed. So we can just say select asterisk from the users table where username equals, and then it would just be a question mark. Then instead of the B placeholder, we would provide a JavaScript array, so square brackets. In there, we just have the one value, and our coworker told us that it would be this. So this dot followed username. You could even just select that and copy and paste it if you wanted to, just like this. Also, I do want to let you know that after this video lesson, there will be a text article lesson in Udemy with copy and pastable solutions for all of the queries in this file. So if you find it difficult to follow along and type in all these queries during this lesson, just know that that resource does exist. Anyways, let's move on to the next task. So task number 2, on line number 29, see if this user is already following this user. So our coworker is giving us the person that's getting followed or that's attempting to get followed, and then the person that's doing the following. They need us to look in the database and see if that unique combination already exists or not. Because if it does exist, well, we need to show the visitor this error message, right? You are already following this user. Why are you trying to follow them again? I will point out that the user would never organically see this message on the website. This is if someone on the website, a user, was malicious and they manually adjusted the settings that their browser was sending to the server. So unless a visitor is a malicious user or a hacker in training, they would never even see this message, but we still need to write this query for our coworker. Also, if you're really paying attention, you might be thinking to yourself, hey, didn't we set up the composite primary key that will guarantee the uniqueness of the followed relationship? And we also set up the foreign keys that make sure the user you're trying to follow actually exists. So yes, we did do that, meaning these entries would never actually make it successfully into the database anyways. But like I mentioned in that earlier video, you can set up these logic checks in the application or program code as well. So this is definitely a bit redundant, but the idea is that our web developer coworker, they've programmed these logic checks or these safeguards into the application code as well. There's no real reason to have it doubled up like this, but this is just the way that our coworker set things up. So let's be nice and write queries that give them what they need. So inside the empty DB execute, I'd say a comma b. For the actual query itself, it would be select all columns from the follows table where followed ID equals, and then it would just be a question mark, and author ID equals question mark. Then, in terms of the values that we actually send along, square brackets for an array, and the first value would be this dot followed ID, comma, this dot author ID. And the I is capitalized in both of those. Cool, let's move on to task number 3. So if you scroll down to about line number 56, we see task number 3. Add a follow into the follows table. So we're just actually creating a follow row. Our coworker is giving us this dot followed ID and this dot author ID. So in db.execute, let's provide a comma b for the first value, quotes, and we're definitely familiar with creating or inserting a row into a table. So it would be insert into the follows table, one set of parentheses, and then the word values, another set of parentheses. In the first set of parentheses, we would provide the columns. So remember, we named them followed ID, comma, we named the other one author ID. Then for the actual values, in these parentheses, that's simple. It would just be question mark, comma, question mark. Then for the B placeholder, that would be the square brackets with the actual values. So this dot followed ID, comma, this dot author ID. Cool. Let's move on to the next task. So if you scroll down, line number 73, we see task number 4, delete a follow. To save a bit of typing, I'll let you know that this query is going to be very similar to task number 2. So what I would actually do is just go back up to task number 2, so around line number 32, and just copy from db.execute. So we don't need await or any of this part of the line, but from db.execute, just select until the end of the line, copy that into your clipboard, and then go back down to task number 4. So task 4, delete a follow, keep the word await, but you can get rid of db.execute, the empty one, because we have that in our clipboard. So just paste in your clipboard. And then really the only thing we need to change is instead of select asterisk from, it would be delete from, and that's it. That's all we needed to change. So we're deleting the specific row from the table where these columns equal these values. Okay, let's move on to task number 5. So on line 86, task 5, is the logged in user following this user? Now this one's a little bit different, so I modified this ahead of time so that you could visit the profile URL without the server crashing, right? Because we obviously haven't written this query yet, but I wanted us to be able to visit this screen to see a list of all posts by this author. In other words, I temporarily added this line where it just returns false. So here's what I want you to do. Delete line number 90 entirely. So delete this return false. Okay. Then on line 89, you can see I have 2 forward slashes in front of this const follows equals and then the db execute line. So that's commenting out the db execute line. We don't want that. We're ready to actually write this query. So just remove those 2 forward slashes at the start of that line, just like this. Cool. So now the actual real dynamic code can run. Now, I'll let you in on a bit of a secret. This query is almost identical to task number 2. So while we still have that in our clipboard, I would just get rid of db.execute here because it's in our clipboard, just paste it in. And literally the only thing we need to change is in this array of values we're passing in, just get rid of the this dot in front of followed ID. And then for the second value after that, so comma after followed ID, instead of this dot author ID, it would be visitor ID, uppercase I for ID. Cool, let's move on to the next task. So down on line number 101, we see task number 6, get the users who follow this user. This is the first actually interesting query in this lesson. So I won't click on it at the moment because it would crash the server, but when you're on a user's profile, you see links here called followers and following, and if you click on one of those, again, we haven't written the queries yet, so it would crash the server, but it shows you a list of all the relevant users. So it's going to show their avatar and their username. So this query should be a little bit of fun to write because we're going to start with rows from the follows table, and then we need to join the users table to actually get their username and avatar. So let's set up this query. In this empty db.execute on line 104, we'll provide a comma b. For the query itself, double quotes. Let's begin with select, and I'll let you know that the only thing we really need to return is the username value, comma, and the avatar value, right? Because we're just building a list of users, and that's really all you need, their avatar and their username, okay? So we're selecting that from, now let's actually start with the follows table and then join the users table on the condition that follows.authorID. Remember, in the relationship of a follow, author ID is the person who is doing the following. They're the one creating the row that's following someone else. And the task here is a list of users that follow this current user you're viewing the profile for. So we're matching based on the person who is doing the following, where that equals, and then we're just trying to find this user in the users table. So it would just be equals users._ID. But the query is not done yet. We need to be more specific because on its own at the moment, this would perform that join for every single row in the follows table, which is not what we want. So at the end here, we're going to add on a where clause, right? And if we think of the actual task at hand, we're trying to get a list of the users that follow this profile user. So it would be only the rows where followed ID equals this profile user. So at the very end, the where clause is where followed ID equals question mark, and then what should this question mark be? Well, in the placeholder B, provide an array, and our coworker let us know that it's simply ID. So altogether, find all of the rows where that's the person that's being followed, but then we're joining the users table so we can actually get access to those followers' username and avatars. Cool, let's move on to the next task. So down on line number 116, task number 7, get the users that this user follows. So that's really just the opposite of the previous query we wrote. So instead of getting the users that follow this profile, now we want to list whoever they follow. So in order to save a lot of typing, I would just scroll back up to line 104 where we just wrote this. We don't need the beginning portion of the line, but starting with db.execute, I would just select the entire rest of that line, copy it into your clipboard, go back down to task 7 on line number 119. We don't need db.execute because that's in our clipboard, so paste it in. And really, we just need to swap these two things. So when we're performing the join, when we're joining the users table, that would now be where follows dot, instead of author ID, it would be followed ID, right? We're trying to find the username and avatars of the person that is getting followed, and then it's the people that are getting followed by, well, the profile user. So instead of this where clause being followed ID, the where clause would be on author ID. Cool, let's move on to the next task. So down on line number 130, we see task number 8. Count how many people follow this user. So the idea here of why this is a separate query is because when you first visit a user's profile, you're viewing all of their posts, right? You're not actually viewing the list of other users here. Those don't show up until you click these links, but even from this initial profile screen, you want to display the count of the people they're following and being followed by. So let's start by counting how many people follow the current profile user. Back in VS Code, we do need to start by addressing the fact that I preemptively modified this code so that the profile screen wouldn't crash, right? Because I wanted us to be able to view this profile screen before we wrote these follow-based queries. In other words, I was just resolving a value of 0. I was just hard coding saying that it's always going to be 0. We don't actually want that. We want a real dynamic value. So I want you to delete this line entirely, line 135 where it just says resolve 0. Get rid of that. And then I want you to uncomment these two lines. So get rid of the 2 forward slashes in front of const on line 133. Get rid of the 2 slashes on line 134. So now it should look like this. Cool. Now let's focus on the empty db.execute. So as always, we'll give it a comma b. For the query itself, instead of a, let's say quotes. Let's select and then use the count aggregate function. Before we fill in the count parentheses, let's make whatever it returns available as followers. Just because that's what our web developer coworker is using in terms of what they're returning to the program itself. So just sort of an easier name to work with. In terms of what we want to count, we can count any column. Let's just count the followed ID column, okay, as followers from the follows table, and then a where clause where followed ID equals question mark, right? So where the person being followed is this user in question, and then instead of the B, it would be square brackets, ID. Cool. Now our very next task, task number 9, is basically this exact same thing, only reversed. So we're counting how many people this user follows. So down in task number 9, I would remove these 2 forward slashes in front of const, remove the 2 slashes in front of resolve, and then delete this line entirely where it's just resolving 0. Okay, then in terms of db.execute, let's just recycle this code that we just wrote from task number 8. So select from db.execute to the end of the line. Down here, we can replace db.execute with our clipboard. Okay, and then all we need to change when we're counting this and we're making it available as this label name, let's change this from followers to following. And then the only other change we need to make is on the where clause. This would now be where instead of followed ID, it would be author ID, right? The follow rows where this person is the one doing the following. Cool, let's go ahead and save this file and test out the web application. So on the front end, if I try to follow the Brad user, whoops, I get an error actually. If I look in the terminal in VS Code, you can see the error message is unknown column. Aha, you can see I misspelled the word followed. So I'm missing the O after the 2 L's in followed ID. So back up in task number 3, here you see I spelled followed wrong. So I'll add an O right there. Let's give that a save. If you save the file, that will restart your server for you. It's very easy to make a typo like that. That's why I'm making these solutions available as a copy and paste resource in the next text lesson. But if I go back to the browser, click back, and now if I try to follow Brad as barks a lot, cool, successfully followed Brad. And now notice the Brad profile says a count of 1 for followers, and if you click on that tab, it shows you the barks a lot user. Cool, we can look at this from the other direction. If we go to the barks a lot profile, notice their tab for following, it shows a count of 1. And if you click on it, they're following the Brad user. Also notice that if you go back to that user, now the button says stop following, and you can click on that to remove that follow relationship. Perfect. And you can see really quick, I just clicked it again to start following once again. Just so you and I are on the same page for the next lesson, why don't you do that as well? So make sure that your secondary user is following your first user. Now that we've set up this follow functionality, in our very next lesson, we can start working on the homepage feed query. It should be a lot of fun to set up because we're going to need to use something called a subquery or a nested query. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we're going to work on the homepage feed, or in other words, retrieving a list of posts from the users you follow. Let's jump right into the action. And actually, before we get started writing any queries, let's first make sure that this secondary user account that we're logged in with has created at least one post. Right, so you have your original account. For me, it was the Brad user, but then you created this secondary account to follow that first user. Well, let's make sure that this secondary user has at least one post. So create post, I'll just make up a title, being a dog is fun. I like being a dog. Cool, let's go ahead and save that post. Perfect. Now I want you to log out or sign out of this secondary user, and I want you to create a third user account. We're doing this so this way we can practice querying for posts from multiple users, right? Because that's what your homepage feed would be, posts from several users. So to really practice that query syntax, we want to make sure that we have multiple users here. So sign up for a third user account. I'll make up a name of Meowsalot. Choose a fictional email address. Make up a password. It needs to be at least 12 characters. And then go ahead and sign up. Okay, now with this third user account, let's follow both the first account and the second account. So in my case, first I would follow the Brad user. So if I search for Lorem, I should be able to find my Brad user, go to their profile, start following them. But then also find your secondary user. So in my case, that would be the dog user, right? They created a post called Being a Dog is Fun. So follow them as well. The idea here is simply that this new third user account follows two different people, multiple people. So if you go to your profile under this third user, your following count is 2. This is great. So now we can practice writing that query that loads posts from multiple users. Now, in order to truly understand this query that we're going to write, instead of going right into Visual Studio Code, let's start in Workbench. Let's give ourselves a goal. So let's use our imagination that we're writing the homepage feed query, specifically hard-coded to make sense for that new third user that follows both user 1 and user 2. Once that is working and it's giving us the results that we expect, then we can hollow it out and make it flexible. So let's start with this. Let's select, for now, let's just select all columns from the posts table. Let's join the users table because we know that we're going to need to display their avatar picture and their username. So join the users table on the condition that posts.author equals users._id. So that will give us the avatar and username, but we don't want that for every single post in the posts table. So at the end here, we would add on a where clause. For the time being, I'll drop down just so it fits on the screen. So for our where clause, it would be where. And remember, we're writing this hard-coded for that third user. So it would be where the posts are authored by. So where author equals an ID of 1, right? So that first Brad user. Or where author equals 2, the Barks-a-Lot user. So if we run this query, perfect. We see all 3 posts from the Brad user, and then we also get that 1 post from Barks-a-Lot. Now, before we worry about making this query completely dynamic or flexible or sort of hollowing it out, I first want to show you a different approach instead of using this OR syntax. So check this out. Let's keep where author, but then get rid of everything that comes after the word author. So we'll get rid of this equal sign and both conditions that we're checking for. So just this, where author, and then instead of checking to see if it equals anything, we're going to use something called the in clause. So give us posts where the author value is in this collection of multiple values. So now in these parentheses, you can just list comma-separated values. So 1, 2, but the idea is you could very easily add on, as many values here as you wanted. But for now, we just want 1, 2. So if we run that query, it gets us the exact same results. Only now, it's a bit easier for us to make this flexible or dynamic. What I mean by that is we don't actually want to hard code this to 1 and 2. Instead, we would want to somehow dynamically pull in the user IDs of everyone that Meowsalot follows. Now, if you're wondering how in the world would we do that, I want to let you know that you already know exactly how we would do that. Or I should say, if we started totally fresh in a brand new query tab, well, starting fresh, you would know exactly how to do that. It's just a matter of how do you do that within this query. So let's start with what we already know. Let's start in a brand new tab, and you would just say, right, select followed ID from the follows table where the author ID equals the Meowsalot user. So their user ID was 3. So there we go. That gets us the results, or that gets us all of the user IDs that user follows. Well, we can actually include this query within that other query we were just writing. So select this that we just wrote, copy that into your clipboard, back in this tab, get rid of the hard-coded 1, 2 in these parentheses, so just empty parentheses. So where author is in this collection of multiple values, in these parentheses, just paste in your clipboard. If we go ahead and run this overall query, we get the exact same results. Perfect. Those 3 posts from the Brad user, the 1 post from Barks a Lot. This is an example of what we might call a subquery or a nested query, right? It's a query inside of another query. Instead of trying to preemptively memorize the technical rules of where and how you can use a subquery, I just encourage you to use common sense and experiment. In other words, if you're using it in a place that's expecting one single value, then your subquery would need to return just one row with just one single column value. In this situation, we were expecting a list of multiple values, so I just returned, right, multiple rows, but each one only had one single column value. So in other words, just try to be super aware of the shape of data that your overall query is expecting and make sure that that's what your subquery is returning. Cool, so at this point, all we need to do is hollow out this hard-coded value of 3 with whatever user is currently signed into the web application, right? And that would get you their homepage feed. Really quick though, before we do that, let's make sure that we're only selecting the columns that we truly need. So instead of select asterisk for our overall query, let's say posts._id. We need that so we can link to the individual post URL, comma, we want the title. You could spell out post.title, but I know for a fact that there's no title column in any of our other tables. So I'm okay with a little bit of ambiguity like that, but there's no one single right or wrong way to do this. Comma, I want the created date from the post table, comma, I want the username from the users table, comma, and I want the avatar column from the users table as well. Let's also adjust this so it sits on a single line so that it's easy to copy and paste and work with in our Nodejs file. So right before the where clause, I just backspace so it's all on a single line. Be sure to add a space after you backspace right there. Cool. At this point, just select everything, so Control A or Command A, copy this entire thing into your clipboard. Then in Visual Studio Code, within our same example app folder we've been working in, open up the models folder and jump into post.js. So yes, that's right, not follow.js, but post.js. In post.js, scroll down to the very, very bottom. So down on line 189, we see task number 8, get posts from users you follow. Now, at the moment, I've preemptively modified this, so it's returning just an empty array. I did this so that the web application wouldn't crash when you visit the home page, right? Because obviously we haven't actually written this query yet, but I wanted us to be able to visit the home page here. So now that we're actually ready to do this though, on line 195, I need you to adjust this. Instead of saying return and then an empty bracket for an empty array, I need you to get rid of those square brackets and instead type in posts. So this line should read return posts. Then on line 192, we don't want this line to be commented out any longer. So get rid of the 2 forward slashes in front of let. And now we see the familiar db.execute. So in these parentheses, you know the drill, it's a comma b. For the first value, quotes. In those quotes, just paste in your clipboard. All we need to do to make this truly dynamic is get rid of the hard-coded 3 and in its place add a question mark. Then instead of the b placeholder, that would be an array, so square brackets. And our web developer coworker let us know that the dynamic incoming value is just named ID. Don't worry, I'll make this overall line of code available as a copy and pastable resource in Udemy. Anyways, let's go ahead and save this file. So Control S or Command S, and let's test it out. So back in the application, if I refresh the home page while I'm logged in as Meowsalot, perfect. I see posts from both Brad and the Barksalot user. However, I'm seeing one last detail we should address. We should set this up so that the newest posts are on top. In other words, order them by the created date in descending order. So back in VS Code, at the very end of this query, so just right before the closing quote, let's just add on order by, and then just created date in a descending order. Give that a save. If I refresh the home page, perfect. That's going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next lesson, we're going to learn how to make the entire process of creating the skeleton structure of your tables automatic. For example, remember when we first created this application? The application itself created the table skeleton structure for the users table and that sessions table. Well, wouldn't it be cool if it could do that for all of the tables, including posts and follows? Well, the answer is yes, that would be very cool. That's exactly what we're going to learn in our next lesson. Let's keep things rolling, and I'll see you then. Hello, everyone. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to automate the creation of our table structure. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, throughout the last several videos, by writing the queries that power our application, we've essentially automated those most common tasks that the database will need to run. In other words, we can give these files back to our web developer coworker, and things will just work without you and I needing to do anything, right? So you could say we've automated those queries. However, what about the actual skeleton structure of the tables we set up? Remember, you and I manually created, back in Workbench, we manually created the posts table and the follows table. And you and I had to manually choose those column names, the data types, manually set up the primary and foreign keys, the full text search indexes, so on and so forth. Now, when we were first starting to work on this project, that made sense because you and I were sort of mapping things out in our own minds. We were experimenting, getting things to work, making adjustments on the fly. However, at this point, now that the application is complete and working, wouldn't it be cool if we could sort of take a snapshot of this table structure so that even if these tables got completely deleted, or if we wanted to start with a completely new, empty, fresh copy of the database, well, wouldn't it be cool if all of these tables could just be automatically recreated? Or to put it another way, at this point, you and I have taken our Mysql expertise and sort of extracted it or automated it in the form of the queries that this application runs. Well, now let's sort of extract or automate that expertise we had when we were creating the table design. Let's make that part of the application code itself. I realize this all sounds sort of abstract, and I think I might be making this sound more complex than it really is. So to bring this down to earth, let's just jump into the file named db.js. So this is in Visual Studio Code, just in the root of our example app folder we've been working with. Jump into the file named db.js. If you scroll down to about line number 20, you'll see code that I wrote, a comment that says, create tables and columns if they do not already exist. Now, at the moment, I've only included code that will perform that operation for the users table. But remember, when we first set up this database, you might remember that the Node application created the users table for us. You and I did not manually set it up. That's thanks to this code. Now, if you look at this code, it should be fairly familiar. Every single time throughout this course when you and I have created a table where we choose the column names and the data type, this is the exact code that you would see on that review screen. You know when you click apply and then it shows you the review screen and you have to click apply again? Well, one of the most beautiful and powerful things about MySQL is that everything we do in it can really just be boiled down to these simple text commands. So the idea here is that our Node application is set up to run this code anytime the application first starts up. So it's going to create this table if it does not already exist. So why don't you and I practice by adding this sort of code in for the posts table and the follows table. Once we have that in place, we're going to be brave and we're going to completely delete these tables in Workbench just so we can see how this code has our back and we don't need to worry. Now, yes, we will have lost any rows and actual data in the table, but the point is that a script like this makes it very easy to deploy a fresh copy of the application, maybe on someone else's personal computer, maybe a different web host entirely. Let me give you a real-world example. So if you've ever visited a message board or a forum on the internet, or if you've ever visited a WordPress, blog type of website, well, the software that's powering those types of websites is really nothing more than SQL scripts. So just for easy math, let's say, there's 10 million WordPress websites out there in the world. The developers of that WordPress software, they only wrote the SQL queries and these commands to create tables once, and then they distributed that software, 10 million different times, and 10 million different people ran those automated scripts. Now, obviously, each person's database contains different actual data, different rows in the tables, but the skeleton structure remains the same. So that's what we're trying to automate here, the creation of that skeleton structure. Anyways, let's try this for the posts table. So in Workbench, within our Node app database, if we right-click on the posts table, there's an option called Copy to Clipboard, and there just happens to be an option called Create Statement. So go ahead and click on that. So that's now in our clipboard. All we need to do now is back in VS Code, maybe on line number 29, so after this closing parentheses and the semicolon, so my cursor's right here, drop down to a new line and paste in your clipboard. We do see a few syntax underline errors here, and this has nothing to do with MySQL and everything to do with JavaScript, which is the language of the file we're working in right now. Because JavaScript is outside the scope of this course, I'll just let you know that to fix these error messages, go ahead and select this first backtick in front of the word posts. So where it says create table posts, highlight, so click and drag or select that first backtick, and then go ahead and press Control D on Windows or Command D on Mac, and notice that selects the next instance of that highlighted character. So if you press Control D or Command D again and again and again, just keep pressing it until you've selected every backtick in that entire bit of code we pasted in. With all of them selected, just hit the backspace character on your keyboard to delete all of them. Cool. Now you can go ahead and press the Escape key on your keyboard. Perfect. Let's just make a couple of adjustments and this code will be perfect and ready to go. So first, on line 30, where it says Create Table Posts, let's change this to Create Table If Not Exists. So this way, if the application tries to run this code and the table already exists, nothing will happen. Okay, so we're spelling out the column names we want, the data types, our primary key, our foreign key, our standard index, our full text index, so on and so forth. Let's make one more change before we go do the same thing for the follows table. So on line 40, keep this closing parentheses here, but we can get rid of the rest of this line. So where it says engine equals, I'll just begin selecting, go to the right, and just delete right up to the semicolon, but keep the semicolon. So the code should now end with parentheses, semicolon. Right here, we can just drop down again, and now we're ready to paste in a new clipboard. So in Workbench, just do the same thing for the follows table. So right-click on follows, choose Copy to Clipboard, Create Statement. Back in VS Code, right in this empty spot, we'll just paste in our clipboard. Let's do the same thing to get rid of these backticks. So select the first backtick right before the word follows, and then just press Control D or Command D and keep pressing it until you've selected all of the backticks. Okay, then press Delete. Then press escape to remove all of those multi-cursors. So the escape key. Now on this line where it says create table, let's change that to create table if not exists. Okay, and then I'll also get rid of this engine equals line, but have it still end with a semicolon, just like this. And then you can get rid of this empty new space line here. Cool. Let's go ahead and save this file. And now let me show you why that is so useful. So back in Workbench, and you don't need to perform this step if you have lots and lots of data in these tables that you care about. So if you've created, 100 example users or a bunch of blog posts that you really care about, then don't do this. But if you don't have a lot of data that you care about, let's actually delete these tables. So for all of the tables in our Node application, I'm just going to right click on them and choose drop table. So we see a review screen. Do you want to completely delete this table and all of its data? Yes. Delete that one. I'll do the same thing for the posts table. I'm just completely removing every single table. So my Node application database now is completely empty. Not only does it not have any rows of data, it doesn't even have any table structures or any tables. However, because we created this automated script, well, you could either stop the web application server and start it up again, or if you just press save in this file, that'll automatically restart the server. So Control S or Command S, that'll trigger a server refresh. And if we go back into Workbench and click this refresh icon or reload icon, notice you can expand tables. All of the tables are back. Now, they don't contain any data, but the point is that you could start using the application. So you can imagine how powerful this is to distribute software that multiple people or multiple companies or businesses want to use. Right? You wouldn't want to give company A the data from company B, but you can distribute your software to millions of people, and this sort of sets up the empty skeleton so that the software can actually run. So I won't bore you with it, but you could sign up for a user and start using the application just like before, only with a fresh database. And that is going to bring this lesson to a close. In our next video, I want to continue on about this topic of sort of having our code be portable, or really just having our new MySQL skills in general be portable. Let's keep our momentum rolling, and I will see you then. Hello everyone. In this lesson, I want to do two things. So number one, share my big picture philosophy with you, which is to prioritize understanding concepts instead of memorizing code or syntax. And number two, I want to show you how your new MySQL skills are very portable and how you can take them with you into lots of different situations or use them from different angles. Let me explain what I mean. So in our last lesson, when we learned that you can control MySQL completely through these text commands, right, that created the table structure without us ever going into Workbench, well, you might have wondered to yourself, why in the world did we use Workbench throughout the course then? Right? Why didn't we spend the entire course studying how to write this code manually, line by line? Well, it's because now that you understand the concepts behind working with a database, columns, data types, keys, indexes, well, now if you decide that you'd like to practice and be able to write code like this on your own without Workbench, it's going to be so much easier than if you took the opposite approach that I see way too many people trying. And that is where you try to memorize this syntax and being able to write commands like this way too early on before you have any idea what any of this actually means or the big picture concepts at play. Now don't get me wrong, you don't need to learn how to write code like this without a tool like Workbench. But I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't let you know that if you asked around in the database community, it's safe to say that Workbench is not the most beloved program in the whole world. Quite the opposite. However, it is the quote-unquote official cross-platform way for beginners to connect to a database. And there are so many different ways to connect to a database, we needed a way in this course where all of us could be on the same page. However, now that we've reached the end of the course and we've learned about the basic building blocks of a database, I want to sort of take the Workbench training wheels off and let you know that you don't have to use Workbench if you don't want to. Because the skills you learned throughout this course are very portable. You can take them with you into all of the different ways that there are to connect to a database. Let me show you a couple examples right now. And let me stress that you do not need to follow along right now, so feel free to just take your hands off the keyboard, sit back, and relax. So this is my computer's command line. Not even tied to VS Code, this is just a standalone command line. In about 2 or 3 minutes from now, I'll let you know how you could try something like this on your computer, but for now, take your hands off the keyboard and relax. What I want to show you is that in the world of computer work, sometimes if you know exactly what you want, it's actually faster to just type in the commands manually instead of using a graphical tool like Workbench. So on my system, I have something called MySQL shell. So the command is MySQL sh. Again, in about 2 minutes, I'll show you how you could install this if you're so interested, but don't feel like you need to. Anyways, from within this tool, by default, it has me in the JavaScript syntax. I want to switch to SQL syntax, so it's just \SQL. Cool. Now, if I want to connect to a database instance, it's just \C for connect, and then my username at the address, so it's root at localhost. It's going to ask me for my password, which is root. Do I want to save the password? I'll type no for now, but that would be a useful feature. And I am now connected to the database. So instead of using Workbench, I can just type commands right here. If I wanted to see a list of all of my databases, just show databases, semicolon. Cool, there we see it. Our Node app, pet foods reference. I pressed the Q key on my keyboard to exit that view. If I wanted to use, let's say I wanted to use the pet foods reference database, semicolon. Notice I'm ending everything with a semicolon. Technically, each individual statement should end with a semicolon, but in Workbench, since we only had one statement and we were clicking a lightning bolt button to run the query, MySQL could figure out what we mean. In this case, because pressing enter both drops you down a line and or would try to run the command, there's a bit of ambiguity, so you absolutely need to follow that syntax rule of ending a statement with a semicolon. Anyways, now that I'm using the pet foods reference database, I could say, show me all the tables. Cool, and then I could say, well, maybe show me the animals table. So press Q to get out of there, select all columns from the animals table. I can press Q to get back out of that. It's also super easy to create an entirely new database from the command line. It's just create schema, and let me name it maybe testing123. Okay, now if I say show me all the databases, yep, there's testing123. Let me start using it, so use testing123. If I want to create a table in that new database, it's just create table. Maybe I'll name it animals. Pair of parentheses, semicolon. Inside the parentheses, you just spell out the column. So maybe I want a column named ID. It would be an integer, not null. I would want it to auto increment, comma. The other column would be called name, and maybe that would be varchar 100. And that should be not null, comma. Let me set the primary key on that ID column. So primary key, parentheses on the ID column. Go ahead and type that in or press enter. Cool, so now I can say, show me all the tables in this database. There's just the one, press Q. Maybe I could say insert into the animals table, parentheses, values, parentheses, semicolon. Just give it a name really quick of meows a lot. And then I could say select all columns from that brand new animals table. There's that one item I just created. And to really prove to yourself that this is doing what we think it's doing, if I go into Workbench and refresh under my root account, there we see testing123. It just has the one table, and there's the one record. So the idea here is that if you work with MySQL often enough, all of these terms and syntaxes and things that you type become second nature. And sometimes it really is faster to just type it in manually like this instead of using a graphical tool like Workbench. However, I think that using this approach from the beginning would have made for a terrible learning experience, because we would have been battling keyword memorization and syntax memorization and super ultra attention to detail instead of using our brain's horsepower on actually understanding the concepts at hand. Long story short, I've seen some MySQL courses that force you to do things this way from the very, very beginning of the course, and I just could not disagree with that approach more. I think now that you're familiar with how databases work, you are in a much better position to be successful using a database from the command line if you choose to do that. Anyways, now that I'm done working with this MySQL shell, the command to stop is just \quit. Cool. Now you absolutely do not need to start using MySQL shell like this, but if you do want to, here's what you can do. From the official mysql.com website, we can click on Downloads towards the top. From this screen, we want to scroll almost all the way down and look for this MySQL Community GPL Downloads link. Click on that. This might seem very familiar because at the very beginning of the course, this is what we used to download Workbench. Well, right above that Workbench link, you'll see something called MySQL Shell. So click on that, MySQL Shell. From here, you just choose your operating system. So you just saw me use it on Mac, but about 10 minutes ago, I also tested this in my Windows and Ubuntu virtual machines. So I won't walk you through how to click this and choose your operating system, but I will let you know that, for example, in Windows, once you've downloaded that file for Windows and installed it, well, to actually open up a command prompt, well, just open up your Start menu and then type in the letters CMD. The suggested command prompt program is what you're looking for. If you click that, you will see a command line. It won't look exactly like mine here, but it will look very similar, right? It's just an old school place where you can type in commands, and then you just type in mysql sh, all one command, just like that. If you're on Ubuntu, obviously, I can't walk through this for every individual Linux distribution, but if you're on Ubuntu, they have an official installer, or I should say a deb file. Do be sure to select your specific version. So for example, 2004, 2104, so on and so forth. Otherwise, it will not work. The dependencies will not line up. To make sure that deb file gets installed correctly, you can use the exact same approach I showed you at the very beginning of the course when I showed you how to install Workbench in Ubuntu. Then it's the exact same thing as Windows or Mac. You just open up your terminal in Ubuntu and run mysql sh. And I almost forgot, if you're on a Mac, to open up a command line like this, it's just an application called Terminal. The easiest way to find Terminal is to just press the Command key and the spacebar key at the same time on your keyboard, and then just type in Terminal, right? Perform a search for Terminal, open up the application. Once you're in the terminal, you just run mysql sh. Cool. That's enough for MySQL shell. Let's change gears a little bit. And now I want to show you perhaps the most common way or the most popular way that most people are ever exposed to MySQL. And that is something that's called phpMyAdmin. If you've ever signed up for a website or a web hosting plan, or if you've ever worked for a company that had a website, there's a decent chance that even if you've never seen phpMyAdmin, you probably had access to it. For example, if you've ever tried to set up a WordPress website for you or your business, well, if you log into the control panel area of your web hosting plan, you'll probably see a link somewhere to manage your database or access phpMyAdmin. A lot of times they will already have a database created for you, and they'll just give you a username and password to sort of log into this phpMyAdmin. So really quick, I'll just create a database and name it example 12345. Cool. So we see that database right here. Since it's a brand new database, it doesn't have any tables, but you can create tables right from within phpMyAdmin. So it's sort of like a web browser version of Workbench. I won't walk you through how to perform every single action in phpMyAdmin, but I do want to show you, for example, one of the most common tasks, and that is importing and exporting a database. If you're ever involved in any sort of website management, that's something that you'll want to know how to do. right? How to perform a backup of the online website's database, or how to move it to a different host, or even just to your local machine. So for example, here's a task. Imagine I want to take my pet foods reference database from my personal private hard drive and pretend that I want to import that into my web hosting account here in phpMyAdmin. Here's what I would do. In Workbench, I would click Server up at the very top and click Data Export. Pet foods reference is the database that I want to export, so I'd click on that. I want all of the tables. Yep. I would choose this Export to Self-Contained File option. I just set it to save it to my Downloads folder and named it petsexample.sql. So then in the very bottom right corner, I'll just click the Start Export button. Okay, and now in my computer's Downloads folder, here I have that file, petsexample.sql. So now imagine I want to import or move or upload this into my web hosts database. So in phpMyAdmin, on that example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you can just click this Import button here. Choose the file. I would just choose petsexample.sql. Scroll down to the very bottom and click this Go button. And that's it. So now my database that lives on my web host's computer, it has all of those tables. Animals, order lines, orders. I can click on animals. You get the idea. What about going the other direction? Sometimes you'll want to back up this copy of the database that's from your web host and maybe move it somewhere. Well, within phpMyAdmin, you can just click Export. So imagine now I want to export this database into a brand new empty database in Workbench. Because I want to export the entire database and not just this current table I'm viewing, I'll be sure to click on the database as a whole first, and then use the Export button up top. Cool. Go ahead and just save this as an SQL file. So click Go. Okay, now I have this brand new file in my Downloads folder called example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in Workbench, maybe I'll create a brand new database. So create schema, I'll name it Import Here. Okay, there you see it. It's currently empty. And then just go up to Server, Data Import. Choose this Import from Self-Contained File, and then just go find that file. Here it is, example 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just click that. Where am I trying to import this to? That's where I would just click that Import Here, that brand new database. Click Start Import at the very bottom. Cool. And now if I refresh the view here, you can see that Import Here has all of that same data. Hopefully it's starting to make sense now that whether your employer gives you a database username and password to connect to remotely, or you're working with a database that's on your local private hard drive, or your web hosting company gives you access to a database, regardless of how you're connecting or accessing the database, the concepts all stay the same. There's tables, there's columns, there's keys, there's indexes, you're writing queries and joins, so on and so forth. The big picture idea here, and the good news here, is that your new MySQL skills are in demand and they are very portable or universal. There are so many different ways that you can make use of them. Everything from writing reports for the marketing team to working on developing applications with your coworkers, so on and so forth. That brings us not only to the close of this lesson, but to the close of this course. More than anything, I hope this course gave you the confidence to start experimenting with databases. They're really not as scary as they might seem to be at first. So until we meet again in another course, thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. I wish you the very best of luck and take care.